Good morning. The 24-hour period that begins with the Last Supper and ends with the burial of Jesus Christ is the most significant day in the history of the world. And because of what happens, it splits time itself in half, BC and AD. And we have the opportunity to join Jesus and his disciples on the eve of this pivotal day. They are engaged in dinner time conversation, and we are invited to listen. With that in mind, take your worship folder, and we're going to read John chapter 13, verses 6 through 11, as we're walking through this series of Jesus' conversation with the disciples the night before he died. They're reclining at table. And again, we have an unspeakable privilege of being able to sit with them, hear what Jesus has to say and what they say to him and what's on his mind on the eve of this historic day. John chapter 13, verse 6 is what we see. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." Then Lord, Simon Peter replied, "Not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus answered, "A person who has had a bath needs only to wash his feet. His whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you." For he knew who was going to betray him. And that was why he said, not everyone was clean. You're clean. That's what he ends up saying. And we got to address two questions then this morning. Who is clean and who is unclean? And with respect to the Last Supper, these questions are really easy to answer. Who is unclean? That's Judas Iscariot. And who is clean? That's the rest of the 11. Clean can be taken three ways. It can be physical, it can be ethical, or it can be spiritual. So you can think of clean in terms of physical clean, ethical clean, spiritual clean. And the question is, as Jesus says, you are clean, but not every one of you. What does he mean? Are you physically clean, ethically clean, spiritually clean? Physical, the dirt on their feet is physical, but I think we know this isn't what Jesus is talking about. He's cleansing the dirt off their feet. In Jerusalem at this time, the streets are muddy, silty, and silt gets on their feet. And so they walked into this Last Supper, and no one was willing to wash anybody's feet except Jesus then ends up doing this. So physical dirt is involved, but that's not really what Jesus is saying when he says, you are clean, but not every one of you. He's not saying Judas's feet are dirty and the rest of your feet are clean. Ethical. You know what ethical means? It's kind of like doing the right things, being moral, being loving, not being hating. Is this what Jesus is describing? That's certainly more likely. Judas is a betrayer. And he will be. Jesus knows that's going to happen. And for that reason, he says, not all of you are clean. One of you are unclean. But then the question is, are the rest of the disciples ethically pure? When he says, you're unclean, we can understand that Judas isn't. But are the rest of them clean? We know Peter's going to deny him. Later on in this evening, where they're having the supper, we know that on the way to the garden, they're going to be arguing among themselves as to which of them is the greatest. And furthermore, how can they be clean from ethical impurity when Jesus hasn't died on the cross yet? You know what I mean? So he says, and you are clean, but what he'll do on the cross will be that which will clean them. How can he tell them they're clean when his sacrifice has not yet occurred? How about spiritual? Spiritual includes ethical behavior, but can't be confined to this. When I think of spiritual in this sense, I'm thinking of the way it would have been in Judaism, where clean and unclean is what allowed you or disallowed you from being able to go into the temple and observe the temple services. If you were unclean, then you were not allowed to go in, or you could only go in so far. Maybe you could go only as far as the gate of the Gentiles, but you couldn't go in any further if you were unclean. It's really ritually unclean. It's that you had done something or didn't do something that meant that you couldn't get in. Somebody who was clean, again, was able to approach God in the temple, and one who was unclean was not. And there certainly were ethical things involved. If you did something ethically wrong, that would disallow you from going in. But you can't confine it to that, because there were a lot of reasons why people couldn't get in. If you had a disease, if you were a leper, you couldn't go into the temple. And there's nothing unethical about contracting leprosy. And there were other things associated with reproduction, a woman's menstrual cycle. That was an occasion in which she was unclean and not able to go into the temple. There's no ethical problem there either. So you just can't confine it to that. When you came in contact with a dead body, directly or indirectly, that disabled you. So if you're walking from point A to point B, and you so happen to step on a grave, and then look back and to see that there's a grave marker there, you couldn't go into church because you come in contact with a dead body through walking on the ground. That's why when Jesus talks about whitewashed tombs, that's why they did that. So they would whitewash the tomb. So if I'm walking and there is a headstone, whitewashed, oh, there's this grave, I got to go around that, because if I step on it, I can't go to church for a period of time, and that's why the whole subject of whitewashed tombs came around. I think when Jesus is saying you are clean, I think what we're going to find is it's the last thing that he has in mind. Not so much physical, not so much ethical, although it involves that, but spiritual. You're in a position to be able to connect with God. I think that's what we'll see. Let's begin with a couple questions, though, and as we apply them, clean, but here's a question. Who's unclean? Look what it says in Luke chapter 11, verse 37 through 41. When Jesus had finished speaking, a Pharisee invited him to eat with him. So he went in and reclined at the table. But the Pharisee, noticing that Jesus did not first wash before the meal. By the way, you see this table here? It's really low to the ground. And so reclining a table, they didn't have chairs. They sat on cushions on the floor. We'll see a clip of this next week. It's from the Gospel of John, the visual Bible. But you notice that those two table legs are just about this big. And so reclining a table, really what they did. So there were pillows and you'd kind of lean. So that's what's happening in this other text as well. The Pharisees, noticing that Jesus did not first wash before the meal, were surprised. Then the Lord said to him, "Now then, you Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness. You foolish people, did not the one who made the outside make the inside also? But give what is inside the dish to the poor, and everything will be clean for you." We talk about the Pharisees, and let's talk a little bit about who they were. How did they come into being? The Pharisees were the descendants of a 2nd century BC reform movement. They were originally called, I'm not going to talk a bunch about this, but just so you get an idea of where they came from and why. They were called the Hasidim, or the Habarim. And both of them have the sense, in fact, all three words, have the sense of somebody who separates themselves. Pharisee literally means the set-apart ones. And they were set apart initially for really good reasons. A couple hundred years before Jesus came on the scene, Israel was under the dominion of the Seleucids. The Seleucids, when Alexander the Great, his Grecian Empire divided into 3 parts, and the Seleucids, they ended up getting part of the pie, and part of the pie they got was Israel. So the Seleucids were in charge. In 167 BC, the Maccabees family, and they became a ruling family. They instituted a revolt that brought a brief period of Israelite independence. In fact, the Jews celebrate Hanukkah, and it has to do with this whole being free and going back into the temple and cleansing it, and it was a wonderful it was a short period of liberation. The Pharisees fought alongside the Maccabees. What ended up happening, they were a party of devout men who fought alongside, but then later on, they separated themselves even from the Maccabees for religious reasons. And again, the name means separated ones. They separated themselves from all who did not fulfill the law, and they separated themselves so that they could, really to an obsessive degree, fulfill all the jot and tittle of the law. Now, again, the law is the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And they needed to know that. In fact, what I read is that they memorized it. But there was the oral law as well. It wasn't just enough to know the written law. There was the oral law. And it's the oral law that ended up becoming, I talked to you about this, very, very specific and picky. And you could walk 1,400 yards on the Sabbath, but not 1,401 yards. You could wear a handkerchief from upstairs to downstairs, but you couldn't carry it because that's work. So if you carry the handkerchief, that's work. But if you wear the handkerchief, that's not work. And so there were all kind of little nuances. And the Pharisees, they spent their whole life observing this kind of minutiae of detail. By the time that Jesus comes on the scene, Israelite dependence is gone. Rome had come in, and now they were under Roman dominion. The Pharisees were still around, and John the Baptist goes head-to-head with them. He's the one that came before Jesus, and Jesus even more so. Jesus called them actors or hypocrites. And his problem with them was not about their devotion. They were very devoted. His problem with them was that image was everything. Image was everything. They did everything for men to see. If they prayed in a place that people could observe them. And I bet you if you ask them, why are you doing this? They probably would say, because we want to model prayer. And giving, they modeled giving. And fasting, when they fasted, they went around like this. Why are you so sad? I'm fasting. And the Bible said that you're supposed to fast one day a year on Yom Kippur. They figured, geez, one day a year you fast. What if you fast 100 days a year? And that's what they did. Fasted twice a week. And when they did, they did. That's what Jesus' issue for them. Image was everything. It's that the problem is, when Jesus talks about change, he talks about change being from the inside out. It starts here and moves out here. It doesn't start with image. And the problem is, when how things look is what matters, how things really are never gets dealt with. You understand that? When how things look is what matters, how things really are never gets dealt with. If we're so busy trying to clean the outside of our life, our inward thoughts and motives never get addressed. The Bible says that our issue, we really have 3 of them. There's thoughts, attitudes, and actions. And it says that God judges the thoughts and attitudes of the heart. Let me tell you, when the Bible talks about thoughts, it's talking about mental concepts that we have about God. That's thoughts. Thoughts are mental beliefs we have about God. Attitudes are attitudes towards God based on our thoughts about Him. And actions are the result of our thoughts and attitudes. So, you remember the story about the guy? Jesus told a parable of a master who had 3 servants. And he gave them different talents. Talent was an amount of money and said, invest it. One invested it and did pretty good. Another invested it, did pretty good. The third guy didn't do very well. In fact, he ended up taking his talent, wrapping it in something, and burying it. Covering it over. And the master came and took an accounting. Said, okay, servant number 1, how did you do? He said, okay, this is what I did. I took that talent and multiplied. He said, well done. How did you do, second servant? This is what I did. Well done. The third servant said this. I knew, listen to what he says. See if you can find the thought, the attitude, and the action. Okay, see if you can do that. I'm going to tell you what he said. See if you can pick out the thought, the mental conception of God, the attitude, which is the attitude towards God and His will, and the action. That's what he said. I knew that you were a hard man, reaping what you did not sow and taking out what you did not put in. So I was afraid of you, and I hid your talent in the ground. Here, take what is yours. Did you get the thought? I knew you were a hard man, taking what you don't put in, and he basically says you want to get blood out of a rock. That was his thought. And what was his attitude? I was afraid of you. He was afraid. And what was his action? I'm going to take the talent you gave me and bury it. And when the master then, in the story, addresses the servant, do you imagine that he calls attention to his action? Why did you bury that thing in the ground? Did he go after his attitude? Why were you afraid? Did he go after his thought? I'm a hard man, reaping what I don't sow and taking out what I don't put in. What do you imagine? How many think he targeted the action? We tend to be very focused on actions. If somebody asks you about sin, what do you think of? Actions. We tend to judge people by how they look. We don't really see motives. And I'm not blowing us up. That Bible says man judges by outward appearance. God doesn't, though. Did he call attention to the attitude? You know what he called attention to? You probably guessed by now. Have you? Do you know what he called attention to? Here's what he said in the story. You thought I was a hard man? Reaping what I didn't sow? Taking out what I didn't put in? What gave you that impression? See, because the thought gave birth to the attitude, gave birth to the action. You know what the most important thing about you is? Your thoughts about God. They will determine your attitude towards Him. And mine too. And they'll determine your actions. What's God like? Is He a hard man? Gets blood out of a rock? If He is, there will be fear and burying the talents He gives to us. The Pharisees' image was everything. And Jesus' mission was to replace them. Look what it says in Malachi. The last book of the Old Testament. Malachi, also called Malachi, the Italian prophet. So he says in Malachi 3, see, I will send my messenger who will prepare the way before me. Then suddenly the Lord you seek will come to His temple, and the messenger of the covenant whom you desire will come, says the Lord Almighty. But who can endure the day of His coming? Who can stand when He appears? For He will be like a refiner's fire or a launderer's soap. He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver. He will purify the Levites and refine them like gold and silver. The Levites are the priests. They're the individuals that represent God. And if you wanted to find out what God wanted, what God was like, they were the ones to whom you would go. It says, then the Lord will have men who will bring offerings in righteousness, and the offerings of Judah and Jerusalem will be acceptable to the Lord, as in days gone by, as in former years. Let me tell you what purify and refine is. You have a silver tea set? You ever see those things? You know what happens to a silver tea set? If you don't take care of it, it gets very tarnished. And I want you to imagine, then, that I have a silver platter upon which you put, there's the cups, and there's the cream and the sugar, and then there's the carafe. And if I have one of these things and it's been sitting around in my garage for a while, and if I take that thing and I take it and reflect it towards you, its reflection is not going to be very good because it's tarnished. And what it describes here is that Jesus is going to do what you would do to that silver tray, which is you get some silver polish. You take silver polish and you rub it on the tray, and what ends up happening? The tray gleams. It shines. That's the image of purify and refine. It's to take something that's opaque and tarnished and make it gleam. So what he's saying, I'm going to go after not the religious people in general, but the religious leaders in particular. Now, this describes what Jesus' mission is. He says, I'm going to go and I'm going to pick out some people, and it's going to be the leaders. And I'm going to take, and by the time I'm done, I'm going to have people in place who can reflect God clearly, not in a tarnished way. He was going to clean these people. And I think that's what he's saying to the disciples. You are clean. You have walked around with God for 3 years, and now you know what He's like. And when somebody asks, what is God like? You can say, I know what He's like. And the Pharisees, the disciples, were in a position to know and to reflect because Jesus had gone, let me tell you what God's really like. And they could reflect it. But there was one whose reflection was tarnished. And who was that one? Judas Iscariot. Why? That's what we've got to figure out. Jesus said He was going to cleanse the Levites. He'll remove the tarnish so that those who represent God will reveal Him clearly. Here's why. Here's a map of Israel. I'm not going to, can't see much detail in it. I just want to show you something. These are 11 of the disciples. And they are from the northern part of Israel. Up there, it's called Galilee of the Gentiles. And Jerusalem is way down south. Way down south. See this body of water here? Kind of down right around there. They're way in the north. It was called Galilee of the Gentiles. There were Gentiles and Jews, and it was a mixture. This is Judas Iscariot. You know what his name means? Iscariot. Iscariot is Greek. It's really Judas Ishkarioth, his Jewish name. Ish is man. Karioth is a city in the southern part of Israel. And here's where Judah was from. Isn't that interesting? They were from the north, from Galilee of the Gentiles. And Judas Iscariot, he was from the south. So you're saying, so what? The Reform movement of John the Baptist, you know when he brought a lot of people and John the Baptist really went toe-to-toe with the Pharisees. Most of the Pharisees in religious hierarchy were based in the south, in Jerusalem. That's why the Reform movement of John the Baptist, it didn't really start there. It started up in the north. You know, that's why James and John and Bartholomew and all those disciples ended up, many of them were disciples of John the Baptist because his Reform movement was flourishing in the north. Why is that? Does that make sense? If there was going to be an Islamic Reform movement, do you imagine that it would begin in Mecca? Mecca is the place that everybody who is a Muslim travels, at one time in their life to do pilgrimage. And a Reform movement to reform Islam is not going to start in Mecca. A Reform movement to reform Judaism was not going to start in Jerusalem. Now, Judas Iscariot is from the south. He's south of Hebron. He's within maybe 1 or 2 days' journey of Jerusalem. So he's saying, okay, Mike, I don't get it. Don't get it. The Pharisees approached the disciples in order to find out, where's Jesus and how can we get a hold of them? Of the 12, who would have been most influenced by the leadership of the Pharisees? Because it was the context in which he lived. Who would that have been? Judas Ishkarioth, the one from the south. The one whose religious leaders were the Pharisees. There wasn't a Reform movement. And so, I think the reason why he says some were clean and some were unclean, you know what made the disciples clean? When they looked at the Pharisees and they looked at Jesus and they were trying to figure out who do we listen to, who would they have listened to? Jesus. Because they would have had a legacy of you can't really trust anybody else. And so when they were looking for someone to reflect God cleanly, they said, Jesus reflects Him. And so they sat at His feet. And it's not that they were ethically pure. It's not that they, but what they knew was, you are the guy. And if we're going to try to figure out what God is like, you're the one we're going to look at. How about Judas Iscariot? Geez, there's Jesus, and I think that was his problem. His devotion was divided. I don't think he was I don't know. bad. I don't know. But I don't think his uncleanness was that he was a jerk. I think his uncleanness was that he was divided. You say, where is Judas? There were many Jews who didn't understand Jesus. And you know what the Bible says? That was purposed. God hardened his people for a period of time until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. But then when it says when the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, I don't know exactly how this is going to happen. What I do know is that God is going to turn back to his people and say, I want to show you something. And he's going to shine them so that they're able to reflect. They're going to see, I never saw. I thought God was this and I didn't. And that will happen in the future. At this point, though, it's not hard to understand, is it? You know, some of us are raised to think some things about God that aren't true. And when we hear something different, it's like we feel caught, don't we? Do you understand what I'm saying? Well, you say this, but that's it. But you did, but and it's not the same because the difference Jesus brought about was astronomical. But all I'm saying is we can understand what it's like to not know what to believe. And the disciples were clean because they had no problem with divided loyalties. Jesus. And you know what Jesus does, really? Do you wonder what God is like? How does God deal with people who are sinners? How does God deal with people who struggle? How does he deal with people who are self-righteous? You know what you can do? Jesus reflects God. No one has ever reflected God like Jesus. He was clean, untarnished. So if you want to know what God's like, look at the New Testament of Jesus. That's what God's like. You say, but Mike, in the Old Testament of the Bible, yeah, there's things that happen in the Old Testament. The Old Testament reveals God the way a tarnished silver plate reveals something. You can see some outlines of it, but it's not clear. If you want to know what God's like, he's not some kind of combination of the Old Testament and the New. God is like Jesus. Bang! Relative to what we need to know about God, Jesus is the reflector. You know what God's looking for? People who are willing to be clean so that they can reflect that as well. Who's clean? Look at who is unclean. Here's a question, I think. What does it mean to be holy? What does it mean to be holy? I would ask you that. What does it mean to be holy? Are you holy? Are you holy? You say, Mike, what does that mean? Yeah, good question. What it says. Leviticus 11, I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourself and be holy because I am holy. Do not make yourselves unclean by any creature that moves about on the ground. I am the Lord who brought you up out of Egypt to be your God. Therefore be holy because I am holy. And what it says, be holy because God is holy. And in the context of the Old Testament, the law, being holy meant distinguishing between clean and unclean. There were some animals you can eat and some animals you can't eat. There's places you can go and there's places you can't go. There's people you can marry and there's people you can't marry. Figure out who is unclean, what is clean, what is unclean. To be holy in the Old Testament meant that you separated yourselves from everything that was unclean. And who are the people that did that to the nth degree? The separated ones. Who are they? The Pharisees. They spent their whole life separating themselves. And they were devoted. They really tried hard. Jesus called their separatistic spirituality into question. He created a different image of what it means to be holy. There's one other place in the Bible where it says, be holy as I am holy. But what you're going to find when you put your finger on the pulse of what that means, it doesn't mean what it used to mean. It doesn't mean distinguish between clean and unclean. You see if I'm right. Look what it says. The last passage we'll look at, 1 Peter 1. Therefore, prepare your minds for action. Be self-controlled. Set your hope fully on the grace to be given you when Jesus Christ is revealed. As obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. But just as He who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do, for it is written, be holy because I am holy. In that context, it says, be holy for I am holy. But being holy doesn't mean distinguish between clean and unclean. What does it mean? It says, set your hope fully on the grace to be revealed, when the grace to be given when Jesus is revealed. Do you know we're supposed to distinguish between not clean and unclean, but now and then? Now and then. Now is the time where we serve. Then is the time, when Jesus comes, is the time when we're going to celebrate. You know what's going to happen if you spend your Christian life separating yourself from clean and unclean? Let me tell you what's not going to happen. You will not be able to do what Jesus does, which is takes off his tunic, wraps a towel around his waist, and washes people's feet. Because you won't feel comfortable coming in contact with unclean. When you separate clean and unclean, when that's what your Christian life is like, I don't drink, I don't chew, and I don't go with girls who do. Now again, I'm not blowing that up. You drink, chew, go with girls who do. But you know what? If that's the focus, you're not going to be able to serve. Not like Jesus. You know why Jesus could serve? It's what it says. He knew He came from the Father, and He knew He was going back to the Father. You know what enabled Him to serve? On this night, He understood that He was going to die the next day, and He was going to be reunited with the Father the next evening, the next couple of days. Because He knew where He was going, it was distinguished between now and then. He took off His robe, tied a towel around His waist. You can serve when you know that 100 years from now, you're going to be with Him. You know what communion is? This is a foreshadowing of a meal we're going to enjoy in heaven, the marriage supper of the Lamb. When we're taken, those who have faith in who reflects Him, will remain in Christ and in His words, sitting at His feet as the 11 did. It reminds us of the meal that's going to happen. It's going to be a great meal. It's not just going to be a little tumbler of juice and a little square of bread. As you think of this thing, we're to think of a couple things. The dinner that's going to come, sitting down with Him in heaven forever. That's what will happen then. And when we think about what's going to happen then, what can we do now? We can do what Jesus did. And He will tell us, do as I have done for you. Here's what's going to happen. We're going to have some music over the course of the next couple of minutes. Come and take the elements. Think about a couple of things. Think of His commitments to you. God says, I'm in you and with you, and good's ahead of you. Those are the new covenant commitments. Jesus said, this is the new covenant in my blood. Think about the meal that's going to happen with Jesus. It's not going to be like this. It'll be something far greater then. And if you think about that, it helps us to serve. Now, again, whenever, just come on up, get the elements, and take and drink in remembrance of Jesus. Let me pray. Jesus, thank you for reflecting the Father. You reveal what the Father's like. You are the exact representation of His being. You reflect Him clearly. And as we hear you, you would have us not to spend our time distinguishing between clean and unclean. There is devotion to that, but it doesn't lead to the kind of life that you want us to live. You would have us to pour out our life, not to carefully protect ourselves from being contaminated. And I'd ask Jesus that we would, as we understand that because of what you've done, cleanness is something that you already say. And as we remain at your feet and understand that we are clean, through faith in you, then we don't have to worry about that. We don't have to put our hand on our spiritual pulse all the time and wonder if we're being good enough. Then we can think about somebody else. Well, I pray Jesus would be more like you. Help us understand what you would say to us, how you reveal the Father, and as we understand Him, that we would know the love that He has, and in knowing that love, that we would love ourselves. In Jesus' name, amen. Next week, we'll continue to get some food for thought as we sit with Jesus and the disciples. Hope you can come back.